But what if they were actually I'm kidding. This isn't going to be one of those videos where I overanalyze a game design element in the edgiest way possible in order to ruin your childhood forever. Give me a little more credit than that. Dancers are consistently the most valuable utility units in Fire Emblem. There are items and skills that replicate most of what thieves and staff users can do, but being able to give one or more units an extra turn is a rare and incredibly powerful ability. It's little wonder that the mainline games all restrict you to having no more than one dancer in your party at a time, sometimes resorting to odd workarounds to ensure that, even when there are multiple characters available who can fulfill that role. There's no need for me to belabor how useful dancers can be to any number of strategies, so let's move on and ask something else. In the world of Fire Emblem, what is dancing? How does spinning around and twirling a scarf give a person the energy to act twice as often? Or however you conceptualize turns in a turn-based game. We can, for the most part, leave some of the series' dancer units out of this conversation. The ones whose abilities are expressly magical in origin, even if they're still tied into the performing arts. We're instead going to focus on Fire Emblem's truly old-school dancers, as well as those that have followed in their footsteps. A series of colorfully dressed young women who have no known supernatural powers, and yet whose battlefield performances have the same effects as those of their magical counterparts. They all cut very similar silhouettes as well, even down to the type of dancing that we see them do on screen. It's easy to surmise that the developers had a fairly clear design in mind for dancers in their games, and that more unusual examples like the Ice Dragon siblings or the Herons are exceptions to an established rule. As to what that rule is, here's where I'm going to have to get creative and do some rhetorical dancing of my own. Fire Emblem is far from the only media to use the performing arts as the basis for character classes. The term spoony bard may have originated in a Final Fantasy localization, but the concept of an adventuring artist empowering their allies with song and dance while also seducing their way through all of their problems goes even further back to Dungeons & Dragons, which of course influenced countless later fantasy properties. That bit about seduction remains quite relevant here given some other, even older cultural associations. First, there are camp followers, a term for civilians who trail after army encampments. Historically, camp followers would consist primarily of soldiers' families and merchants, and Fire Emblem typically provides the player armies with followers of this type in the form of vendor NPCs. The term, however, would also come to be associated with women who follow armies and provide soldiers with relief in exchange for compensation. You might even say that their presence is refreshing. Now then, I did say at the start that I wasn't going to conclude that Fire Emblem's dancers restore their allies' energy via the charms of the oldest profession. That would be needless clickbait. And it's generally not how that sort of thing works anyway, if you know what I mean. Strictly speaking, all of these characters make sense being read as performers, and their dancing simply invigorates those around them on its own merits. I suppose it's meant to be analogous to something like cheerleading in American sports, even down to the obvious fan service value. It might be a little silly to think about dancers getting down in the middle of a battle, but there are stranger sights in this series. With that said, though, there is something to the lengthy connection between the performing arts and assorted bohemian pursuits. Several of these dancers have explicit ties to thievery or to fortune-telling, and as we'll look at in a bit, there's a world-weariness to the way that some of them are written that suggests a double meaning to dancing as it's interpreted in Fire Emblem. And not to go too deeply into my personal life, it's a meaning that I am especially interested in given some of my own experiences. Because I'm not quite certain what YouTube will be finicky about, I'll go ahead and rip the bandage off with a clip from another JRPG that says the quiet part out loud. This all started early on in the Kaga era, especially in the Yggdrasil games. Fina might be the original Fire Emblem dancer, but it's tough to stand out in any way as a character when all the dialogue you've got amounts to a single conversation and a death quote. It's Sylvia, Lean or Lelia, and Laura who really lay out the potential double meaning of dancing. Granted that it's not particularly comfortable to read given the ages of some of these characters used in supplementary material. Seriously, do yourself a favor and don't look up how old Sylvia is in the manga adaptation. It makes all of her dialogue so much worse. I guarantee that if IS ever remakes Genealogy, the whole cast is going to get aged up substantially. That aside, the references to difficult audiences getting too handsy, or splitting on you without warning, or to how dancing can be made into something unenjoyable depending on the context. I'm not a stage performer, but lines like these nevertheless resonated with me based on my years in the demimonde. Lean sighing and accepting that dancing for unappealing men is just part of her job. I've been there before. All of these women find themselves in some dark situations, even by Yggdrasil standards, but there's a sentiment of making the best out of a bad situation, and finding pleasure in what you do that's pretty much as good as you're going to get out of this type of character in this type of setting. The GBA era of Fire Emblem was a noticeably brighter one, in more than one sense of the term. We can generally leave out Ninian, though, unless you really want to read some unpleasant stuff into her time on the run with her brother. The other two games feature dancers more in line with those of the Kaga games. Binding Blade's Larum is in several respects in much the same vein as Sylvia, only with a loving stepfather to give her a more stable home life. That doesn't prevent her from chatting up a host of men, including a pointedly uninterested Percival, and an Ogier who's thinking what we're all probably thinking whenever IS writes a character like this. Her interactions with Garrett don't mince words on that point either. Also, Larum jumps on Roy a lot. That's pretty much her running gag in her limited story appearances. Read that as you will. Tethys in Sacred Stones takes some more liberties with the character concept, removing many of the vaguely uncomfortable comic relief elements. She's notably written to be an older character than past dancers, a member of a hardened mercenary company, as well as a guardian to her younger brother. As with Lean, Tethys' dialogue doesn't shy away from drawing comparisons between her work and that of mercenaries, between two different forms of selling one's body, so to speak. Her flirtations with her support partners are also understandably more adult. She's substantially more mature about the prospect of sharing a man's affections with another woman than Sylvia is, just as an example. Following her, we come to the only fully traditional dancer of the modern era, Awakening's Olivia. I don't have much to point out here, not least because Awakening is pretty well known for constructing its characters around prominent gimmicks that tiresomely repeat themselves across too many support lines. Olivia's gimmick is that she has a debilitating case of stage fright, except on the battlefield for some reason. That's a trait that wouldn't logically work on a dancer, and it mostly doesn't. Although it does build into a setup for IS's first ever attempt at sorta writing a male dancer, even if it's not until his third game for Inigo to actually make it as a dancer in the full gameplay sense of the label. In any case, the roundabout way in which Olivia's shyness inspires her son to be a shameless womanizer does at least wink at the sexual undertones of her class. Although when held up alongside Awakening's much more in-your-face approach to fan service, it's practically chaste when compared to how earlier characters of this type are written. Returning to Inigo, his journey outside of his introductory game does somewhat mirror the adjusted direction that IS has been taking the dancer class since Awakening. Not so much Fates, which gives its resident refreshing performer magical water powers, while also letting her keep some of the class's darker backstory traits. Rather, I'm talking about Three Houses, which recontextualizes Dancer as the prize in a school competition, and thereby opens up the class to around 3/4 of the game's playable cast, including a fair number of male characters. As is almost always the case with free-form class systems, This comes with the unfortunate side effect of flattening Dancer out into a more generic class than it's ever been. Even the dancing animation is unusually limp and awkward in houses, possibly as a result of the need to be applied to all of those different unit models. That did not, however, prevent the developers from falling back on some of that classic Dancer writing. There's not one, not two, but 3 characters with histories that tie into the performing arts, specifically opera in this case. Some of this stuff gives me flashbacks to my time reading a bunch of 19th century French literature, where practically every moderately wealthy young man keeps an opera dancer or a small-time diva as a mistress because, again, age-old association. Even little details stand out to me, like Dorothea's carefully non-committal liked dining hall quote, which conceals her interest so as not to appear too enthusiastic. Like, yeah, I get it. Manuela might be one of the funniest and most relatable characters Fire Emblem has ever come out with as far as I'm concerned. She'd be a blast to kick back some drinks with and gripe about men. Like the others, she also doesn't pass on a chance to allude to the dark side of life in the theater. It is a little odd to me when people look at these lines and their only thought is murder, because that's somehow a more palatable alternative to buttering up nobles with a little death or two. That's some weird priorities if you ask me, but anyway. There's also Yuri, who stands out even more for being a male character with this same sort of writing, even down to the innuendo-laced dialogue about doing stuff with men and, oh wait, direct comparisons to the sorts of things Dorothea was expected to do to please her audiences. Not gonna lie, I really appreciate that. It's pretty much the closest any of the male bi-for-Byleth characters ever come to reading as queer on their own merits, independent of their monologues to the void that is their gender-variable teacher. It's a real shame that Yuri's in the game that opens up the dancer class to just about everyone. There's no way that IS would ever return to that well and... Wait. Hold up. Is that what I think it is? A male dancer with his own unique class and writing that takes full advantage of that? How will this even sell Heroes alts? Wow. Touché, IS. Seadoll is genuinely kind of amazing. Screw male Pegasus Knights, this is the kind of break from long-standing gender lock tradition that Fire Emblem really needed, on account of all the implications packed into dancing and, dancing. Seadoll's particular brand is less cabaret and more caravan, and his obligatory dash of unfortunate implications comes in the form of not so quietly starving himself for his art, but that is nonetheless in line with what we've seen with dancers thus far, where there's an implied darker element to his work that's never explored in depth. Sadly, eating disorders can also be an element of the performing arts, whether that's literal dancing or turning tricks. I don't really care for how fandom reduces Seadoll to that, though. There's more to him, like his use of a simplified use of tarot for fortune-telling, which also ties back into the red light lifestyle. You may be able to tell that I'm starting to run out of family-friendly euphemisms, so let's wrap this up. What can we take away from all this? Clearly not the answer to the question I posed at the start, because there really is no concrete answer to how non-magical dancing in Fire Emblem is supposed to do what it does. It's just a suspension of disbelief thing, like why corpses disappear off the battlefield, or how Byleth can eat 10 meals in a row without exploding. Dancing is a tactical element dressed up in a standard D&D inspired class fantasy, one which places a series of worryingly underage girls in skimpy and often vaguely orientalist outfits. And even when they're not that, the outcome is still not an especially tasteful one. Like a lot of things in Fire Emblem, the presentation of dancing isn't that pretty if you think about it for more than 5 minutes. With that said, however, I find that there can be something positive that can be pulled out of the way these characters are written, even if that was never the developer's intention. There are a variety of stigmas surrounding sex work, and the depiction of sex work in media, and I fully expect to get some comments to the effect that I am attempting to insult or slut-shame these characters, even though I'm tying what they do into a form of work with which I have intimate personal experience. But I wanted to make this video regardless, for all those times where these characters find joy and fulfillment in what they do, even in spite of the hazards that come with the job. That's a more meaningful class fantasy than most of those found in Fire Emblem, precisely because it's such a thorny subject to discuss openly. And the significance of what they do bears out in gameplay as well, because dancers are some of the most valuable and irreplaceable units you can deploy. Dancers are the ultimate in low-effort, high-value units. Their stats don't matter so long as you can get them where they need to be to duplicate the value of the rest of your army. As in stage performances, and so too in other forms of entertainment, the real trick is in making it all seem effortless. And that goes for being on YouTube as well. What a segue. Tell me what you think about how Fire Emblem writes its dancers down in the comments, and don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to my channel to let me know you're enjoying these types of videos, and that I should keep exploring more FE related topics. Au revoir!